Hey guys, this is Eric Weingartner with Weingartner Racing. Today's video is about what to look for when you're disassembling a head. In other words, there's a way to inspect it or see what you should be looking for when you take it apart. Now, there's no way in the world I can cover everything in all my years of doing this quickly, because some stuff is just like second nature to me, and I'm not being arrogant, that I don't think about to say. So this may not cover as much as you want, but I'm gonna give you as much as I can. Anyway, first off, usually what I'll do is I'll take a heads and I'll go ahead and vacuum test them and to see if they're pulling vacuum. But I know a lot of people don't have vacuum testers, but what you can do is you can put a solvent down in the runners and let it sit for a while and see if it's leaking. However, sometimes it just could be not so much the valve job is bad, but some trash got in there just because, like, maybe you're scraping off a header gasket and the valve's still open, and some of that trash gets in there, then you close the valve, well, it's stuck there, and it didn't do it while it was running, and it happened because you were just cleaning and stuff got in there. However, for the most part, that's pretty rare. Anyway, so usually if you vacuum in, you also do if you do some solvent, you'll see a mistake. But before I take them apart, I want to show you this. Look at the valve tips. So this is a set of Brodix, by the way, Race Right 270s. Okay, look at the valve tips. This is where your wear pattern is. Now, this guy had a roller tip rocker, and you can see the pattern that it's putting out right here. This actually gives you a lot of clues about what's happened with the head. Now, somebody's gonna say, well, that's not centered and it must not be right. Actually, I'm quite happy with that. And the reason why is not so much that it's centered. That's kind of one of those old things. It's how wide it is. Because this pattern that you see here is called the sweep. The wider it is, means the less correct your push rod was. It means that the valve roller is traveling over the valve more, causing it to wear in the valve more. Also mean it's pushing against the valve. It's not ideal. Small wear patterns like this are easier on everything, the valve train, everything else. And if you saw my last video about valve train deflection, what I didn't do and I should have done was use an incorrect push rod and then a correct push rod to see how much deflection you have, because it's actually more deflection when you've got things wrong. So this may not look centered, but it's actually really good because that's a really narrow pattern. Because what you're looking for is a narrow pattern, not necessarily on the center. So there's one thing. However, while you're looking at the stem, what you need to look at is you need to see the pattern itself. Not only that, but are there more than one? You can see this one that's coming right down here. What you need to be aware of is when you get something that looks like, and I think I saw one there. You see this? You got your pattern in the center here, but you see how that wear here and here? And it looks like here and here? I think I saw one other one too. Yeah, that one's real bad. You're like, what am I looking at? This pattern should be the normal one, right? But then you've got flares here and flares here. This happens because of valve flow. Now, naturally it's gonna spin a little bit through the run process, but it's slow. When you've got movement here, and look, I could tell that's still fresh. When you got movement here and here, what that means is it's floating the valves. So there's a good indication you're starting to lose valve control. Now, like for instance, that one's fine, not fine. This could be an indication that maybe this spring's not up to task, like it's weak or something, or it's not been installed the right pressure, because sometimes people put in the same shims all the way through. Now, in ideal worlds, they should be the same shims all the way through, but because of machining tolerances or just things going wrong, sometimes you might have one more shim, like a 15,000 shim in here that shouldn't be in here. And you're like, oh my gosh, that's wrong. You don't know what you're talking about. No, I have seen heads where the valve job hadn't been necessarily done wrong, because from the deck it's the same, but the pockets got machined off somehow, especially usually it tapers one way down, and then by the time you get here, you're like, oh my gosh. Or you'll have an extra shim because the installed height's different, okay? I know it sounds crazy, but that does happen. So that's not saying that this happens. In the ideal world, these all should be the same. Like all the exhaust should be the same and all the intakes should be the same. Not necessarily the same for each other, because sometimes, especially on big blocks, you have different length valves for the intake and exhaust. So you can have different, same installed heights, but it might take more shims or something to get it on the intake versus the exhaust. Anyway, so this spring itself might have been just set up wrong, or most likely the case, they probably have the exact same shims. This one could be just weaker, causing valve float to happen. So there's one thing to look for, okay? The other thing is, on this little teaching thing, look for something that doesn't belong, like it's not the same. So when you're scanning the head, just look for things that aren't there, okay? All right, and so if everything looks like it should be, then you're good. But to be a good person at engine building itself, you need to look for the oddball things that doesn't normally happen. And that's how you can spot things like this, okay? All right, so that's the first thing you look at, tip pattern, see if you have anything there. There's a couple other things we can look for to see signs of valve float, and I'll show you that. Let's continue on. I'm just going to tear apart the head. I'll show you real quick. Me tearing it apart, and I'm going to go lickety-split. Okay, with it all tore down, I'm going back to the phone. It does better at capturing images whenever it's close up. With it all tore down, there's a couple things you need to examine. One's the retainers, and the other one's the locks, okay? If you have bad valve float, it'll show up on this. This is like an early sign, okay? But I should point, like I said before, they will naturally spin through the life cycle of the valve or the engine running. They'll gradually move, and you won't have a pattern anymore. But when you start having a star already forming, usually means something's up. But here's a good way to tell too. So prolonged valve float will cause some weird stuff in your retainers you need to look for. What you're looking for is when you look in your retainer, these are good. When you look down the center of them, these are black, of course, because these are chromoly. If you see shiny right through here, that's a very good indication of valve float. Because what's happening is the retainer's coming off. Let me pop one apart real quick. Okay, during valve float, what happens is the spring will come up, the valve goes down, and then it's got all the energy and it whacks back up, and then it goes back down because it ricochets, or you could see it rebound. So it hits the top when the valve when it's closed, and then the spring slightly goes back in. But if it has enough pressure, what'll happen is these retainers will come loose like this, and then when the spring comes back and hits it again, boom. In other words, it's loosening, turning, bam, bam, bam. And it's causing it to keep spinning around that. Now you might say, well, you're wrong about that. It's called spring surge. I didn't do a good job of explaining it, but it's really just when the valve, it has energy. When it's coming this way, it comes up, it's going to hit this. We like to think it just stops, but what happens is it comes here and then wants to go back. The other thing, and if you watch my last video, this can happen. Push rods can also store energy. So they flex. They'll go from straight like this, but when you put pressure on them, they want to bend. Well, when the valve starts closing, now there's the force that's holding this valve up is now less, so the push rod can now give its energy back. And when it does that, it's at these moments, and that can actually push the valve open itself, okay? And that causes valve float too. However, if you look at it that way, it's pushing the valve down, and even though the spring's still on it. It's the surge really that usually causes it to rotate and spin. So loses control, spins, comes this way. So when I'm looking on the inside of this, I'm looking to see if there's any shininess inside this. And as you could tell, this one doesn't. The other thing you want to look for is the locks themselves. Okay, you want to see if they're shiny. Now these don't look that bad. You're all going to have a little bit of where some of the black oxidizing comes off. That's kind of natural. What you don't want to see is something that looks like, I actually grabbed one, like this. Camera's having a hard time focusing. This one's not as bad, but this is starting to show signs of it. You can see how it's starting to spin. You can see the lines. I thought I had another one that's worse. Yep, I do. And then you get this. And if it's real bad, what you'll start seeing is this pitting. And what that happens is the lock's actually spinning inside here, and it's creating friction, and it's micro welding itself to that, and then that micro weld gets broke. And when it does, it has these little pits that will be in the locks, which you can kind of see. This one's really not that bad, but it's the only one I had handy that can kind of show you. Okay? You can also look on the inside. This is the bad lock. And you can start seeing shiny on there. This one's really not that bad, but it's not ideal either. These ones really, if you look at them, these are the ones that came off. They look pretty much new, so which is good. All right, so that part's done. The next thing you want to do is look at the tip of the valve itself. Sometimes, especially on 7 degrees locks, these are 10-degree locks, okay? 7-degree locks are a little bit different. They're really bad, the 7 degrees are, about pushing up against this ridge in your valve, and it mushrooms out the top. And then when you go to try pushing the valve out, it won't go through the guide because it's mushroomed out here. And then what you have to do is you have to somehow file this down just enough to get it to come out. 10-degree locks don't do that as bad. So this one, as you can just tell, I pushed right through. So you're looking to make sure that happens. So I just push it with my finger and it should pop out. While I'm doing this, I'm checking to see how much the valve wiggles. Now this is a years of work service thing to see how much play it has, and you should have a kind of an idea. I'll get my final measurement of how loose the guide is whenever I go doing the valve job, because I'll put different pilots in. And I know I've got one that should be in there, and then there's ones that means it's way too loose. So it's almost like a go, no-go gauge. Anyway, so that one, of course, feels fine. So you pull that out. Then you study the stem itself. So let's put it up here and look. You are always going to have a little bit of, this is the exhaust valve, where some of the exhaust residue comes back up here. What you don't want to see is in the main part here, and you can see where this is where it's wearing on the guide, okay? What you don't want to see is a big old chunk like this where you have black sections, because usually what that means is it's gotten hot because it's got too little guide clearance and it's rubbing against it, and it's kind of creating like a little bit of heat in the valve, and it causes some discoloration. So if you see that, usually it's an indication that your guides were too tight and you're lucky you didn't stick one. Okay, but this one really looks good. This only right here this is the movement from your valve. So you want, like, how much cam lift you have. If these had never been run before, you really could probably measure that, and that'd be your cam lift right there, because that's where it's rubbing. All right, so that's that one. And I'll go ahead and pull out one intake valve just to show you that one. By the way, sometimes they get really kind of wedged in here. Oh, pushes right out. And boom. There's that one out. Now, this should be an indication. Look at the face of the valve. Not really, that's the face, but look at the back of the valve. You see all this gunk build up? This could be a sign of a bunch of stuff. You're like, oh my gosh, the guides are bad. There are many things that can cause this one. Luckily for me, I already know this one because the customer kind of told me. His intake gasket leaked, so it sucked in oil. And oil goes here, gets mixed with some of the heat and the reversion, and it kind of congeals, and there's where it stays. These will all be cleaned up. And as you can tell, studying the stem, doesn't look that bad. It doesn't really look like they have that much wear on them, so that's pretty good. Usually you'd see a bigger pattern here, so not bad. You could tell not all valves are perfectly smooth because you can see where there, or it could also be in the guide itself. That causes that. But so far, those would be fine for now. They'll get refaced and stuff else otherwise. Okay, I'm gonna take all the valves out and I'll show you the seats and we'll talk about that. Actually, one more thing. This is one of my pet peeves. These are shims right here, okay? You're gonna have those on any aluminum head. You have to use some kind of shims or an ID locator to get the correct installed height for the spring. Now, since I've already taken apart this head, what I should have done also, but I'm not reusing these springs, and you can tell looks kind of weird there. That seal does. It is weird. See what I mean? Point out, look for things that don't belong. Look at this seal. It's not in all the way. It's not down all the way because there's a ridge where it should be sitting. It's further up here. So it's not even, they did not put the seal in all the way. That's also why it's kind of cockeyed. So when those seals aren't installed all the way, they don't sit perpendicular with the valve, and you get the idea. Anyway, if you notice, this one also is missing the spring. Now, he said that they wanted the spring not to be on that. Some customers prefer that on the exhaust side because it gets more oil for the exhaust, so that it helps with lubrication. Although in my opinion, if you have the right guide clearance, you can put a spring on it and it'll be fine. I have circle track engines that are like that and they're fine. If your guides are too tight, then that's a different story. Anyway, back to this. Usually I'll check the installed height just to see what it was if I'm reusing springs. I'm not. These shims need to be used, but what is missing and what should have been used is an inside diameter locator. Let me see if I can find one real quick. This is an inside diameter locator. Now clearly this one's not the one that fits the spring, but what it does, it sits in here underneath the seal, and then the shims sit underneath this. And what it does is, this one will not made to fit this one, but what it does is it sits there and it helps locate that spring and it keeps it from moving. Because as it is, the only thing keeping this spring from dancing around is your retainer. And you can see some wear on the bottom. This is kind of normal too. Not real bad. If you have a dampener in your spring, by the way, they'll start cutting through this retainer, so you need to check that too. I've seen one, I used to have one here that I kept as an example, that the retainer, it was a titanium retainer and it had a dampener. These don't have a dampener. So I don't think, nope, no dampener. They would cut through, start cutting into this, and almost cut all the way through the top. So if you have one with a spring with a dampener, you need to check that too. These don't. But anyway, what was I saying? Oh, the only thing holding the spring from moving is this retainer, but it's only holding it at the top. So what that means is, as the valve's being opened, it's going to deflect a little. The valve does move around, so it causes the spring to move around. So it's causing some weird things to happen, and it might cause more uncontrollability, not having the ID locator down there, because there's nothing holding it at the lower part of this valve. So we correct the retainer, but you also need the correct ID locator to keep it from moving down at the bottom. I know you're like, this should be good enough. I promised you, the valve itself is moving, dancing around. It might be a few thousandths, but it's moving. To keep it more steady, it's better to have it there. It keeps everything, the spring and everything, better in placement and better all around. These don't have that. So you're like, so you don't need them. See how much movement I can move on that? That's a good amount of movement, okay? Now some heads don't have to have those, because Brodix does not put ID locators in their heads. These didn't come assembled by Brodix. You know how I could tell? They don't put exhaust guides and exhaust seals. Brodix doesn't do that. Someone else did that. But on some of their heads, you don't need it. Let me show you real quick. Okay, these are a set of Dragon Slayers. Now, if you look at how they've machined out the pocket itself, okay, if I put the spring in here, this is a 155. This one's actually a one, I think it's smaller, like 1.4. If you put a saw roller spring in theirs, because of the aluminum that's around it, it prevents its movement really. Now this one's not the right spring, it's a much smaller one, but you get the idea. It sits in there and prevents its movement because it's got metal or material all the way around it to prevent it. So it doesn't necessarily need an ID locator, although I always put one in anyway. So there's what I mean. Let's continue. Okay, now I've got the valves out. I'm gonna show you this before we go any further. If you're like, I need to check the valve job, you can look at from a running engine after it's been ran. There's some clues to tell like the valve job needs adjusted. One, if you're usually this, there should be a on the intake side, there should be a clean metal all the way around where the valves sit. This is called the seat. And if you're like, why not the exhaust? Well, exhaust gases get in here and it causes the thing to be black, and that's normal. But what you want to look for is like what this has is pitting, okay? Which actually I think that's in the upper part. But you can look, what you need to see is if there's any pitting. That's a dead giveaway. You need to do a valve job anyway, because something's happened to cause it. Usually what does that is, this is a prime example where there's oil that comes through and it turns into like a crystal almost, and then it kind of dissolves the seat and you have pitting. There's other ways too, but that's one thing to look out for. But if you have valve jobs bad, and this one, oh, there's a good example. You see that? This is on the exhaust side. Okay, I'm doing my best to show it, but the camera keeps trying to focus on my finger. See that carbon looks right here, that carbon tracking here? This is a dead giveaway also that the valve job is not very good. If you ever have a head and you see where there's like carbon tracking where it looks like it's coming out, especially in this, it's usually in the centers, by the way, and you see it coming out like this, it's given away that the valve job is not sealing up, especially there, because gases are getting through and you could see it that way. Like the valve closes, but maybe it's coming this way. For whatever reason, either way, you'll see something, and that's giving it away. Let me get a little closer. Not as bad as I thought it'd be, but you can kind of tell. Definitely on this side. Yeah, there's some stuff. Maybe not as bad as I thought upon further examination. But anyway, if you see that though, I wish I had a head to show you a great example, because usually you'll see like the black all the way through. And you're like, yep, not sealing. And sometimes you'll see it on this side too, like the exhaust, like during the combustion, it's trying to force its way back through. So you see instead of a line like this, which this one's so oily, it's hard to tell, but you'll see the carbon coming back. So something to look for. Let me see if I can find another one. Well, that looks bad, but let's zoom in and make sure. That's a good example though. We got carbon here and here, I bet you it's not sealing there, because you see how it fans out? Probably because there's a not sealing right there and it fans. Okay, something to look for. Let's see what's on this one. Yeah, that's another one. Make sure ain't, yep. Yeah, see how it's clean? There's your example. Chances are pretty good. The valve job just wasn't all the way in. I should also point out too, with new heads, the seats will move a few thousandths until they take their set. It's usually why, if you could run a set of heads on the, perfect world, if you run a set of heads on the dyno, get a good heat cycle in and maybe make a pool, take them back off, do a refresh, they'll be better than they ever were brand new. But anyway, yeah, there'll be something like that. Usually it tracks all the way across though. Like you'll see it in the seat too. Maybe just hadn't ran long enough to see it. So there's something else for you guys to look forward to whenever you're trying to tear them apart. The last thing you need, and this is, you may not have the stuff for, is you need a straight edge. Like so. This is my machinist one. There we go. And what you do is you set it down and then you use a feeler gauge and you do X's. So I have it like that. But take a feeler gauge and if you can get, to me, if you can get a 3/1000 underneath any one point, just go ahead and have it surfaced. Although most heads need surfaced anyway. Like it's so rare for me to get a used set of heads that's been ran, put it on the mill, and it cleans up in 1/1000 or even within 3. Usually it takes about 4, and most heads come in by 6. You usually should have it, which is about 1 cc. So you go that way, and then this way. Checking each spot where it touches the head if the feeler gauge goes underneath. However, you'll need this, and these, I don't know how much I even spent on this. It wasn't too bad, but you'll need this. Machine a straight edge. After that, take your parts, label them, clean them up, and then get to work. So hopefully that gives you some things to look forward to whenever you're tearing apart heads. If I didn't answer all your questions, put them in the comments, and then maybe in a later video I'll get it together. I'm sorry if this one went long. Want to make sure I give as much information as possible. Anyway, you guys take care. Once you get it here too, after you're done looking at the valve job, look at the deck surface. Check between the bores, because after the head gasket comes off, it'll tell you how things are. Usually the worst spots where they are is typically in the center of the head, at least on a small block Chevy for sure, because you have 2 exhaust ports together. However, any other head's the same way. Usually the center ones are usually the worst. And what you're looking for is, if you could see where the gasket, like this has got a clear ring, so it looks pretty good. What you're doing is seeing if there's any gases that have come across, just like you were looking for it here, you're looking for it to see if it happens there, okay? That's one thing to make sure that you got there. On the note on the deck, do not use like a Scotch-Brite, or don't use like a circular disc to clean these up. Because I've seen a lot of people get the right angle grill, or it's not right angle die grinder with like a Scotch-Brite disc, and just, I promise you, you warp the heads bad. So you have, in other words, it'd be low, lower, high, low, low, high. It's never the same. And like, no, it won't. No, it won't. When I put it on the mill, just to do the skim cut, just to make sure it's at 0, you'll see it clear as day. Like, it's all over the place. Don't do that. That's probably one of the worst things to do. Don't do that. You might get away with it on the intake side, but not really. It's best that you use a Scotch-Brite in your hand, but and a razor blade scraper or the plastic ones. But the reason why you may get away with more on the intake is because you know you're going to put silicone around the the water jackets, and the gasket could take up like 60 thousandths. It's not really holding back a whole lot of pressure compared to the cylinder ones, the head gaskets. So there's that. All right. Another note on the valves. This one just came out, and so I'm showing you this. You see how it's got like, looks like lines, like puff, 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 all the way across? Typically this happens because the valve, they were really in a rush when they ground, and it's not perfectly concentric all the way around. In other words, it wasn't faced best it could be, and that can do it. You can also check that right here is our seat surface. You can see where it's been spinning, because you can see runs in it where it looks like it's turned. I don't know if my camera can capture it right. The thing you need to check also on this is pitting. If there's pitting here, it's not the end of the world, because I'm going to reface them anyway. So they'll get blasted, clean first, blasted, and then refaced. But hopefully I can get rid of it. If it can't get rid of it within 5 thousandths, I throw the valve away, just buy a new one. But anyway, there's that. So I forgot to show you that, just spotted it. Anyway,